Good evening, my friends, and welcome to Moments with the Master. My name is Albert Dixon, and with me, or I am with a good friend, John Henry, and we're the hosts of this program, and we look forward to our studies together as we engage in God's Word. We invite you to, if you have any questions or comments at the end of the program, you'll be given the opportunity to ask those questions, make those comments, and they will get to us because John and I'm the preacher at the Mill Road Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, and John is the preacher at the Church of Christ in St. Leon's Church of Christ in St. Leon, Indiana. And so we invite you to study with us. Again, if you have any family or friends that are interested in a program like this, let them know, because we do this Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. And I know it has been a while since we've been on,
Yes,
John.
Yes. I'll explain that. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, I had become very ill and experienced a lot of pain, and went to the emergency room, had a test done for COVID-19. The results were negative, but I had all the symptoms for COVID-19. After that, I had 2 more tests, and they both come back negative, but I experienced these symptoms for about a week and a half to 2 weeks. And so because of that, and then being quarantined, because of what I was going through, that's why we haven't been on for about a month. So I just wanted to let you know I am doing a lot better as far as overcoming the virus that I had. Still have some problems because, of course, I had pneumonia with it, which was a bacterial infection, and so I'm still that part is kind of still in the healing process. So I'm doing good, and there's no as far as they can tell, as far as the COVID-19, there's nothing, it come back negative. There's no signs of it or anything else. So doing good, and I'm grateful to God and for the prayers and for the opportunity that I have to be back with my good friend and good brother Albert Dixon, and to be with all of you out there that watch us. So it's good to be back.
Yes, it sure is a blessing, John, to have you back. And like I said, been praying, and God has answered our prayers. And so we continue to look forward to our studies together. As I said, here from we're in the Old Testament. We're going through the plan of salvation. And just to remind or catch everyone up, we got to the book of Leviticus, and we are going through that book. And we have found that the book is really rich in helping us to understand the work of Christ as it sums up. Because when you look at those things that are expressed, you can see Christ in the ultimate sacrifice that God was providing for mankind. As we were looking at even the laws, you can see those laws that are expressed here in the book of Leviticus is really helping and pointing to the conduct of how the Christ would be when he comes, as we will eventually get to that study in the New Testament and looking at the life of Christ. And so it is a very rich book to help us to understand those things that have occurred in the New Testament. And remember that these things were a shadow of the things to come, and Christ in his way was the substance. And so that's what it was all about. But you could see this here in the book of Leviticus, and it has been exciting, John, in our studies.
So, yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And another thing, before I forget, we as you noticed, we tried to put what chapters we're going to cover. the last program that we did, we did chapter 18, but I've learned that there was no sound to it, so we'll just kind of give you maybe like a quick overview, and then go into chapter 19. I think because I know that I was contacted and said that there was no sound there.
And one of the things that we had learned and talked about in chapter 18 was these immoral relationships,
right,
and what God expected of them in their conduct towards one another, and the proper relationship. And that's what we talked about in connection to especially the close blood relatives. Those things
right,
were unlawful, as God pointed this out to the children of Israel. And we had seen, John, and you could look back and see why that was told to them. Number one, it is in line with the character and nature of God. Number two, those things that was done, remember, some of those things were practiced in Egypt. And God is making this distinction between his people and those of the world and their conduct. And so the instruction is given here in chapter 18 is to show this is inappropriate, unlawful, sinful. But this is the way it's supposed to be done.
Yeah, because chapter 18, it basically starts out with a very stern warning, that Moses is to give the children of Israel. He's not going to tolerate anything that is immoral that they learned in Egypt, nor is he going to tolerate anything that they might pick up that they see in the land of Canaan, the promised land that God's going to give them. And so God is pretty, direct,
right,
as far as what will happen if they, try to go either way. We might say keep the customs of Egypt, or,
right,
take on the customs of the Canaanites, because, God kept saying there in chapter 18, which he will in 19 and 20, that he is a holy God, a pure God, and he expects his people to be that, to be the same way. And that's what he's trying to teach them in all this, that they have to remain pure. God, this is God's scheme of redemption. He's working this out through time. There's a reason for all this. They might not understand all of it right now, but we can go back and look, and the point is, his son is coming, the Messiah,
right,
the Savior of the world, and he's coming through, this little nation.
right.
And so that's why God demands so much purity on their part. And, it's a hard lesson, as we're going to see, for Israel. It was a very hard lesson. Even when Christ came, it was still a hard lesson for the majority. Of course, throughout this whole time, God had a righteous remnant,
right,
that were faithful to God. They remained pure. They kept the commandments of the law. They done what God required.
right.
And so that was the basis of the, that God used to work with as far as, the Messiah coming into the world. Because, there's a time when God takes them into captivity, but it's the remnant, those who were faithful to God.
Right. And one of the key verses, John, that you had mentioned in connection with the nations not to take on their conduct and actions like those nations was in chapter 18 and verse 24. Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, for by all these things the nations which I am casting out before you have become defiled. And so God is going to be using Israel to bring judgment on those nations because they had become defiled in their idolatry, in their immoral conduct. And so now they're going to be cast out. And Israel is going to be given this because they are God's people. And as they continue to follow the judgments and statutes of God, they're going to stay in the land. And God is going to protect them and be with them.
And, just to kind of look ahead a little bit again, this is one of the reasons why God sent the prophets. They would get out of line, and the prophets came to bring them back, or to bring them back to God, so that they would get in line with these, what we're talking about right now, that God is a pure God and a holy God, and, this is the way God expected them to walk, and later on they begin to deviate from it. God sends them to prophets to try to steer them back, but they don't want to do it. Right. And then we know that when Christ gets here, of course we know from reading the Old Testament that it seems like a good many prophets are put to death because they don't like what the prophets have to say.
Right.
So we can take care of that. But they would not return to God's standards through the prophets. Yeah.
And then that brings us to chapter 19, John, where you start to see really this is how they are to deal with holiness towards God and with man. And remember, back in Exodus, we talked about the 10 Commandments. And what you got was these 10 Commandments really is an outline of what God points out specifically in the law of how they were to conduct themselves, because the first several commandments deal with one's relationship with God, that they were not to put any gods before Jehovah God, and those things. They were to keep his name holy. And then you start to see the rest of those commandments start to deal with the relationship with man to man. Now, Leviticus chapter 19 deals with those specifics of that, and how, first of all, chapter 18 dealt with those things as well, but chapter 19, you start to see that come out clearly in reference to this. And one of the key phrases that we even saw in the beginning of chapter 18 was, I am the Lord your God. That's a key phrase that you see over and over again. So when it started out in chapter 18, verse 2, verse 2, and then you see it pick up more and more in chapter 19, John. And so I thought, it's eye-opening, and there's significance to that. When God says this is the way it's supposed to be, and then he says, I am the Lord. You follow my directions. You follow my guidance. You keep my judgments. You keep my statutes. And that's what he's laying down.
Right.
And that means that you have God's approval, and they need to be taken very seriously, because these are God's commands.
I think that's a good point that you make, about the saying, I am your God, because back there in the book of Exodus, we saw, when God got ready to send Moses down, Moses started making excuses, and then Moses said, well, who do I say has sent me down? And he said, tell them I am sent you.
Right, yeah.
And so we learned that, God's name, I am, and we also learned that means that he is the true and existing God. Yes. There is no other God besides God Almighty. And I think when God says I am, and referring to himself as the true and existing God, that you've got that over against all the idols, this idol worship. Now,
yes, that's right.
I will suggest this from the Old Testament even into the New Testament. If we watch carefully, even to a lot of times to hear the apostles speak in the New Testament, they're always fighting this thing with the idols.
Right.
And they'll always, in the New Testament, that there are at least 3 different places. Peter used it, I believe, in 1 Peter 4:11. He said, if any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. Paul used it twice in other places, but in each reference, if you study that closely, whenever an idol would speak, they referred to that as their oracle.
Right.
And so, you have hey, you going to listen to the oracle of these idols, or are you going to listen to the oracles of Almighty God, the great I am?
Right.
And so I just want to put that out there so that we realize that and notice that. And it's, like I said, it doesn't start just in it. It's it already has started when God said, I am.
Right.
Because they was down there in Egypt, and here were all these Egyptian, gods, the idol gods that they worshiped.
Right.
And he says, I am.
Right.
I am. I'm God. You might have learned what you did down here, but now you're going to, the people that had that ingrained in them were going to have to try to let that go. And God was going to try to get that. But I think, like you said, it's a very important point when we look at this and we understand what God is trying to do when he says, I am. I am the true God. There is no other God besides God, Almighty, the God in heaven, the God that created all things, the God that created us. Yes. These idol gods are nothing. Yes. They have no power, nothing. As a matter of fact, we know that later, in the Old Testament, there God makes fun of them. He said, because, here you are, you take gold or ivory or silver or wood, and you carve out a gold. You got to pick it up and move the thing. And it doesn't talk to you. Right. It doesn't have any power to do anything. Yeah. And, it's kind of comical, the way God described that. But like you pointed out, and I concur, I agree wholeheartedly with you that this is a very, very important thing that is carried throughout the Bible, because as we're going to see, it doesn't matter if it's Egypt, in the land of Canaan, the Babylonians, the Assyrians later, they've all got their idol gods. Right. And so, but nobody defeats I am.
Right. And another, as you were talking, John, you just sparked another thought in connection to chapter 19. In these laws of, number one, dealing with idolatry, dealing with man's relationship to God and man's relationship to one another. This also brings out, when that statement, when he says, I am the Lord your God. Remember, God created man in his image and likeness. And you start to see this in this dealing with one another. Because the way that we would deal with one another is how God deals with us. And then God expects for us to deal with each other that same way after his nature, after his character. And so these instructions kind of help us to be formed in the image and be what he intended for us to be in our dealings with each other. Right. That's another thing I see when you point out about the I am, that we are to be like him. And we're going to see this in the first couple of verses here of the chapter. So it just so many things that just come out when you're talking about these things, and as you look at them and you start to see them come forth. And so we do this as we're going through this, that you'll be able to see that as well.
Well, just like in verse 2,
yes.
Maybe you've read it there a moment ago, but back in verse 2 of chapter 19, when he said, speaking to the congregation of the children of Israel, saying to them, ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy. Say, your God. I am your God.
That's right. Yeah.
So he makes a point of that to make sure that they get that.
Yes, and they are to be holy. Mm-hmm. They are to conduct themselves in the image and the character of God. That's why you see the instruction. Then verse 3, every one of you shall reverence his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbath. I am the Lord your God. You see that? Yeah. The intensity is being picked up. And to recognize and have reverence for mother and father, because remember, these are the parental of the children, and they are God's. They are to be emulating how God deals in reference to authority, guidance, And the parents are to be caring for their children and instructing their children. And so the children, when they have reverence for mom and dad who are guiding them in the statutes of God, they are then learning to be in the image of God and ultimately recognize the authority of God, his character and his nature. And you start to see all of that come forth in this chapter.
Another thing, not to keep going, but one thing that comes to my, keep bringing this up, but one thing that comes to my mind when of course, what we've talked about, then listening to you, is, when he says here, ye shall fear every man his mother and father, and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Another thing that comes to mind when he says, I am the Lord your God, what was it? Well, I had something, I know you said something there about, how God has created us. And I can't remember what I was going to say about that. But, again, it goes back to this idea that, God is our God. You weren't, I know what it was. The Greeks, they always had these fables or stories that they made up and like to tell, about the gods, you had your gods, your demigods, and all this other stuff. And the gods would, have relations with a human being, and you had this, you got this total mess.
Right. Yeah.
But yet when you read this, I am the Lord your God. Respect your parents.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, these stories that we hear today, when we go back, not just the Greeks, but the Babylonians and others. They've got these stories about gods and how the world come into being.
Right, yeah.
And some of the things that they believed or rules that they had that were made up, of course, because it went along with their idol gods.
Right, yeah.
But here again, God says, I am the Lord your God. I regardless of what the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Babylonians, Assyrians, whatever those other nations might have thought, God let them go the way that they wanted to go in Romans chapter 1 there, because they were nothing but heathens. I mean, God couldn't do nothing with them. They made the decision, and God let them go their way.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Again, you see that take precedence here. Verse 4, do not turn to idols or make for yourselves molten gods. I am the Lord your God. Going back to the point that you're saying there, you see that in verse 4. Verse 5, now when you offer a sacrifice of peace offering to the Lord, you shall offer it so that you may be accepted, and it shall be eaten the same day you offer it, and the next day. But what remains until the third day shall be burned with fire. So if it is eaten at all on the third day, it is an offense, and it will not be accepted. Everyone who eats it will bear his iniquity, for he has profaned the holy thing of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from his people. Notice, if they wanted to be accepted by God, they had to do what God said.
Right.
That's how the sacrifices were to be done. And so if you wanted to have this peace offering, and that is to have peace with God, then you're going to have to do it the right way. You're going to have to do it on God's terms, not how you feel, not how you think. And it may look good, and it says good for the third day, and God says, no, it's not. Then that means it's not, whether it looks good to me or not. And so in this case here, whether it looked good to them or not, it had to be observed the way that God taught in these things. Why? Because he is the Lord. He is God. And that's the point, that he's laying down those instructions because he's the one that they should adhere to.
Yeah.
In other words, to do things their way would be to take God from being the ruler and establishing themselves. And a lot of people do that in religion today, where they go by what they feel, what they think, right, instead of, as you mentioned about, if any man speak as the oracles of God, instead of revealing and teaching God's way, they have their own way. They have their own thoughts. And so it ends up being that they have exalted themselves in this position, and therefore they have made themselves an idol and not God, who is the true and living God.
Amen. I was just sitting here thinking that because it just come to my mind when you said, while you was talking, it just popped in my head that, when we talk about here's the oracle, a lot of times they were like ventriloquists, and they'd make these idols talk.
Yeah.
And so these laws or commandments that these idols were given literally come from men. So they were the one that were, operating behind the scenes. Sometimes I've even heard that they had the idol setting there, and maybe its mouth would be open a little bit. And there would be like a pipe going down, and they could go in there. What they called the priest had a little niche or something. They could go in there and hide and speak through and make it talk.
That's right.
And so really, and that's basically true what we're saying, that right, yeah, the man becomes like an idol, and everybody listens to the man.
That's right. Yeah.
And God says, hey, we're not supposed to do that. God's a holy God. You listen to me. And me only.
Yeah. What you were saying, John, there was a movie made about that. It was called The Wizard of Oz, remember? No.
Yeah, I remember that one.
And so you do see that's what idolatry is. But when it came to the instructions that was given to Israel, it was given from the true and living God through Moses as he conveys these things to the people. And you could clearly see it is a matter of holiness. It is a matter of righteous conduct, because God is telling them how to behave in their relationship to him. And if you're going to serve him and sacrifice to him, it has to be on his terms. This is what he wants.
Holiness is something that affects every part of one's life.
Absolutely, yeah.
Everything that you do. But even as we look at it here, and you go through the Old Testament, and you come up to today, like we've been talking about, man still rejects the holiness of God to allow that to appear in his life and to be subject to it.
Right, yeah.
And that's what God was after here, is what he's after today.
Right.
Peter makes that clear there in 1 Peter, I think it's chapter 1, where, he pointed out to the Christians that, hey, God's a holy God, God's a pure God. And
right, yeah,
just paraphrasing, he expects that out of us.
Right.
Well, that's what he expected out of them back there. So it's no different.
Right, exactly.
And whatever God tells us, as far as how to live, how to worship, then we are to respect that and obey God.
Absolutely. And so these are very valuable lessons, again, as we were saying, that you look at Leviticus and you see this throughout these kinds of statements that are made. John, as we're fastly getting to the end of our time, we'll just look at verses 9 and 10. Now, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, nor shall you glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. Instructions to maintain the dignity of even those who are needy and poor. Right. Because remember, they are made in the image in the image of God, and so they are to maintain that dignity. And one of the things is work. The poor, the rich were not to just hand it to them. No, the poor was to go out and work and earn it, and it would help maintain their self-respect, their dignity.
Yeah, and this is the same thing that we see in the story of Ruth.
Right. Yeah.
When they would, she was allowed to go through and glean.
Yes.
And this is, God has always been concerned. Let me say it like it. it shows God's concern for everyone. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. You know, God has concern, and you know the way that God operates. You know, like you said, you know, He's concerned about the poor, but He doesn't want the rich to give it. Here's what I'm going to do. Right. I'll tell the rich to leave it. You know, they go through. They can pick their grapes or whatever. Leave the corners. And and then the other, let them glean.
That's right.
Yeah,
self-respect. I mean, maintains that.
Yes.
My friends, we are out of time, and we certainly enjoyed spending these few moments with you as we looked into God's Word and look especially the book of Leviticus. And we encourage you to join us next Thursday at 7 p.m. as we continue to spend moments with the Master. But in the meantime, may God bless you as you continue to search out His will and His way.